Hello and welcome to this episode of Asian World Podcast with Dr. Hawkins. Today we're going to examine the phases of colonial resistance. Now, inevitably, I always get this question from students. I spend a great deal of my time teaching about empire, and I'll always have students either in class or after come up to me and they'll say, Dr. Hawkins, when we look at these histories and their legacies, I really have one question. Why didn't the indigenous peoples fight back more often and earlier in the colonial experience? Why didn't they recognize what was happening and then organize and resist empire? I mean, they outnumbered the Europeans, certainly in Southeast Asia, by hundreds of thousands, if not millions to one. How was empire able to impose itself on such a wide expanse and such a large population without consistent, regular resistance on the part of the colonized? And it's a good question. I mean, it really is, especially if we look at the vast history of empire. And so what I want to do today is I want to take us through the phases of reactions to empire. This will show us not only how empire takes hold, but how the indigenous react to it and eventually resist. Before we look at the phases, though, we have to get rid of two ideas. Okay, so I need you to get two ideas out of your head. Idea number one is when we talk about empire, particularly in Southeast Asia, in India, to a lesser extent in China, you have to get rid of the ideas of Spanish conquistadors. So 9 times out of 10, when I talk about colonialism or I talk about empire, I get students that have these ideas of mass invasions, waves of disease, fire and war dogs and conquest. And though there was some of that in the history of empire in Southeast Asia, India, and in East Asia, this really isn't the story of empire. So we need to get that out of our minds. Empire is something very, very different than it was in the New World. Second idea we got to get out of our heads is we can't retroactively impose upon either the colonizer or the colonized the conscious identities that we have today. So if we were to go back in time 400 years and we were to go to the East Indies and I was to run around saying, Indonesians unite against the Dutch, they would have no idea what I was talking about. They wouldn't even understand what that meant. And so the idea of nationality, race, nation state, organization, we can't falsely impose those things on peoples of the past and expect them to organize relative to these consciousnesses of identity that we have. We like to give a kind of ahistorical status to things like race, identity, nationality, etc. But those things are very modern inventions. Those kinds of impositions, those kinds of identities in the past just don't always make sense. Okay, well, let's talk about phase one. Phase one is acculturation on both sides. Now, what I mean by that is that humanity across the globe has an innate ability to rationally calculate their own best interest. And even though we like to have the trappings of identity and loyalty and all that, human beings at their base make rational calculations every day relative to availability, to prosperity, to penalties, to opportunities, and they navigate their way through life, maximizing their power and opportunity. And that's a universal law of humanity throughout time. And so very naturally, when empire comes to India or when empire comes to Southeast Asia, it brings with it a tremendous amount of power and a tremendous amount of opportunity. And so rationally, the first response of many indigenous peoples is to acculturate to empire. And that means to gravitate to power, to mimic behaviors, to conform yourself in a way that you'll maximize your affiliation, opportunities, and power relative to empire. Now, of course, as we talked about in Orientalism, this isn't a one-way street. Europeans seeking to maximize their opportunity will acculturate themselves to local indigenous power structures as well. And so we get the British acting like Mughals. We get Spanish priests in the Philippines mimicking the behaviors of patron clientism and big men. And so the first instinct for both imperialist and colonized is to acculturate to each other to maximize opportunity and power. They just want to thrive. And when we look back, much of empire is built on this form of collaboration. So if we think back to India in the 18th century, Robert Clive is sent to put down a usurper to the Mughal throne, the Nawab of Bengal. And when Robert Clive leads an army against the Nawab in the Battle of Plessy, he's leading a Bengali army. And I get students to say, well, the Indians were fighting under British command against an Indian royal governor, essentially is what a Nawab is. And my answer is yes, but essentially In the complexity of this early phase of empire, Robert Clive is leading a Bengali army against the Nawab, which is a usurper to the Mughal Empire. So in a roundabout way, he's fighting on behalf of the Mughals, on behalf of the dynasty in India. And the Mughal emperor, the Shah, recognizes his contribution. And as a result, the British East India Company gets the Diwani, meaning it gets the right to collect taxes on behalf of the dynasty. And so what happened in this phase of acculturation is that the British Empire is acculturating to Indian power structures. Both the Bengalis in East India and also the Mughals are acculturating themselves to the powers and opportunities of the British East India Company. And each is sort of manipulating and using the other as all peoples rationally pursue their best interest. And this is how most of the human experience is played out. Even when we get to later phases of empire, acculturation is still the name of the game. The British in India create a vast colonial army comprised of Indians, known as sepoys. And they make it very lucrative. They give access to pensions. They give access to power. But most importantly is the British co-option in what they call subsidiary allies of the Rajas throughout India, of the principalities. And I do this exercise with my class where I show a picture of a British imperialist and I show a picture of a Raja. And I give them a common case study in the history of British imperialism in India. I say, look, here's a Raja. He's approached by agents of the company. The agents of the company say, you are the monarch of this vast domain. You have good fertile land and an abundant population. I'll tell you what, if you would like to convert 70% of your land to cash crops, if you'd like to grow cotton and indigo and maybe some sugar and pepper, then we'll give you global contracts and we'll act as the intermediaries because the Raja doesn't have access to the global market. And we will take those cash crops, we'll sell them on the global market, we'll give you your cut, and we'll all become fabulously wealthy. Now, your part as the Raja is to mobilize labor through local networks and through local power structures, and then facilitate the growth of these cash crops, and then we sell them. And so the question is to my class, is the Raja a British imperialist? Now, almost unanimously, they look at the picture and they say, no. And I say, well, explain to me why not. He works for the British East India Company, as does the British imperialist in the photograph opposite. He's mobilizing to grow cash crops so that he can sell on the global market, which is also a British imperialist activity the world over. He acculturates himself to British power structures. The British are acculturating themselves to him. So why isn't he a British imperialist? Now, eventually, the students will kind of get more uncomfortable and more uncomfortable. And in the end, they say, well, he can't be a British imperialist. And I press them and demand to know why. And eventually, they'll settle on something like his race. And I often tease them. I say, well, that's kind of a vulgar and arbitrary line to exclude him from being a British imperialist, even though in function, in calling, economically, he's functioning as a British imperialist, or at the very least, a subsidiary of British Empire. And this also complicates the morality of empire. So I carry the case study a little bit further when I say, okay, the British agents came, they contracted with the Raja mobilizes labor, converts 70% of his land to growing cash crops. They sell on the global market. The Raja becomes fabulously wealthy, and thereby some of the people become fabulously wealthy in his kingdom. The company becomes fabulously wealthy. However, after several years of this, the monsoons don't come as scheduled. And there's a subsistence crisis as all the crops failed. Now they've converted 70% of their land to cash crops and 30% to subsistence, meaning that they're growing crops they can eat. When those crops fail, 100,000 people starve to death. Are those deaths on the British for being imperialist? Are those deaths on the Raja for collaborating with empire? Or is it simply a legacy of imperialism as a bad system in its totality, including all? And this is the kind of complexity that we get when we delve into the acculturation phase of empire. Next, phase 2. We have what's known as accommodation. As empire becomes more oppressive and more intrusive and becomes more asymmetrical in power, in which the colonizer divested of more and more power, and that is invested in the imperialists, The colonized move into a phase known as accommodation. Now, they don't want to give up all contacts with empire. Empire is still the rational choice. It's still access to power. It's still access to opportunity. However, its oppressiveness is starting to make them feel uncomfortable in various phases of their lives. And so in the accommodation phase, the colonized begin to learn to adapt around empire. They begin to learn to live with it. Now, this manifests in a couple of ways. It manifests in something that drove the imperialists crazy, which was kind of a misunderstanding and a mischaracterization, and later a kind of slur against the colonized. And oftentimes you'll go back into the colonial records, especially in Southeast Asia and India, and you'll see this common trope where the imperialists are accusing the indigenous people of being duplicitous, meaning you can't trust them. They'll lie to you. Now, what the imperialists are fundamentally misunderstanding is that in many situations, the imperialists will demand a behavior or an action on the part of the colonized. The colonized don't want to do it. It's not in their interest. It's in the interest of the imperialists. Nevertheless, the colonized don't want to give up their connection with empire, which is still accruing them benefits. And so they will say, yeah, of course I'll perform that behavior, right? Of course I'll perform that action. And then they don't. This was really common during the civilizing mission in India, and really all over Southeast Asia as well, where imperialists would go and say, look, you need to start putting your children into these schools. And they say, yeah, of course, my kid will be there. No problem. Absolutely. The kid never shows up. They go back and ask again. And the family says, oh yeah, for sure. Absolutely. Oh, I'm sorry. We just spaced. He will be there. I promise. And the kid never goes. And imperialists in their writings will characterize this as duplicity. They're all liars. You can't trust them. Well, that's not what's happening here. They're not liars. They're accommodating you, right? They're trying to accommodate you to get out of things they don't want while still maintaining a connection. I mean, on a micro-social level, we've all experienced this. You ever been at a party and somebody says, you know what, we should go out and get something to eat after this. And you, wanting to be polite, say, oh, I can't. I got to go home and do a load of laundry. And they press, well, why can't you do a load of laundry in the morning? That would be easy. You could just get up extra late. It won't take long. And then you come up with another excuse and another excuse. And technically, you're not being honest with them, right? You're trying to come up with reasons why you don't go. But you don't want to sever the friendship with the person. You want the benefits of that friendship, but you also don't want to do something that you feel is, on a very micro scale, socially oppressive. And this is exactly what you get during the accommodation phase. Another way that the indigenous peoples will accommodate is by hiding cultural traits. So the colonized are very astute, especially as we get into the 19th century, at deducing exactly what the Europeans like and exactly what the Europeans don't like. And so the colonized become very adept at hiding the aspects of their culture and aspects of their lives that Europeans wouldn't approve of, and prominently displaying those that they do approve of. And so what you'll see throughout empire is a kind of interiorized self, where the indigenous act in particular ways in their homes and in their mosques and in other private spaces of indigenous culture. And then they'll have an entirely different persona when relating with imperialists. And again, it kind of drives imperialists crazy, especially when we get to the Orientalist project and they're trying to figure out what exactly is and is not indigenous. But what's happening is they're accommodating. They're putting on a persona that will still maintain the benefits of empire while avoiding some of the more complicated entanglements of disapproval from colonial regimes. Similarly, the indigenous will begin to censor themselves. There's certain words they won't say. There's certain pieces of clothing they won't wear. There's certain behaviors that they won't engage in. And this self-censorship is a way to simply avoid the oppressiveness of empire. If they know empire disapproves of a certain thing and thereby empire is going to try to eradicate it or intervene to eradicate it, you just avoid it by not doing it where they can see it. Finally, as a form of avoidance, the colonized will often adopt dual identities. This is particularly effective with religion, but again, it drives the imperialists crazy. So if I am an indigenous person and I know that colonial contracts or colonial opportunities are coming to those who will convert to Christianity, I'll get baptized. I'll convert to Christianity. It's fine. Even though fundamentally in every other aspect of my life, I continue to be a Muslim, or I continue to be a Hindu, or I continue to be a Sikh. I'll convert to Christianity for the sake of accommodating the imperialist. Now, again, it drives them crazy. It drives the imperialists out of their mind because they feel like everything is inauthentic and nothing is stable. Everything seems to be a shifting illusion to the imperialists. And again, what the imperialists don't understand, like the boorish person at the party or the salesman that will not get your hint, they're accommodating you. That's what they're doing. They're just accommodating you, and they don't want to completely sever the relationship. Now, this goes on throughout the course of empire, as empire is always posing inducements for collaboration. And so it never really goes away. However, when that becomes unbearable, when empire becomes more oppressive and more interventionist, then the colonized have to transition into the third phase. And the third phase is avoidance. Whereas accommodation is a relationship in which I want to maintain contacts while still accruing benefits, avoidance means I just want to get away. I don't want any more relationship. And so avoidance takes many forms. First and most obvious is move. Just move in physical space. If you have the means, if you have the opportunity, move with relatives to another town, another province, another part of the world where empire will not be so oppressive. And so we get massive internal migrations within the colonies as people move from the lowlands to the mountains, from the north to the south, from the seacoast to the interior, to try to avoid the oppressive interventionist nature of empire. We also get mass migration out of the colonies. There's a huge Indian diaspora in the 19th and 20th centuries across Southeast Asia and into Africa. Similarly, out of Southeast Asia, the great Chinese diaspora. And so when empire becomes oppressive, the quintessential human response is just to get away from it in physical space, if possible. Another tactic to avoid is to completely change identities. Now, whereas in accommodation, I'll have a dual identity. I'll remain Muslim. Well, when I'm around Europeans, I'll pose as a Christian or at least acknowledge that I have been baptized. When we get to the avoidance phase, I will completely change identities depending on where the pressure is most intense. So for example, in the 19th century, if the British have a civilizing mission that's focusing very specifically on Hindu practices, great example is by the time we get to the middle of the 19th century, the British are on an absolute crusade against sati, or the Hindu practice of widow burning. They're also on a sensationalized crusade against a mystic, supposed Hindu cult called Thugee, which was thought to perform pagan rites and rip people's hearts out. If you've seen Indiana Jones and the Temple of Doom, they have a spin on this. It was all made up. It was all a creation of the press. The Thugee were just highwaymen. Most of them were actually Muslim that would rob people and kill people. But if the pressures of intervention, if the pressures of the civilizing mission are so intense on Hindu communities, then I'll just claim to be a Muslim. And I may convert, and my whole family may convert. I may claim to be a Sikh. And so changing identities is a good form of avoidance. Become something that they approve of. Do not be something that they disapprove of. Now, this causes a tremendous cultural crisis among the colonized. And you can see now we're getting to really ugly, sinister, evil empire. Because just to escape the oppression, they'll renounce 1,000 generations of a religious tradition or 1,000 generations of affiliation with a culture, just because life becomes so unbearable under empire. And so changing identities is one that we see throughout. It's really fascinating in the scholarship. Finally, in terms of avoidance, and I think this is the most interesting, what if you don't have the means to move? What if you don't have relatives in the provinces? What if you're already recorded in the colonial census or in other ways as Hindu or as Muslim? What if you can't change those things? Well, then you're only left with one other form of avoidance, and that's mental avoidance. And I find this particularly fascinating. The first form of mental avoidance is, of course, chemical self-medication. If there is a drug or there's a chemical that allows a person to escape the difficulty of their life, even for a little while, then human beings are very apt to take it. And by the time we get to the 19th century, opium use becomes widespread throughout the colonies. In many cases, the imperialists will encourage it as an inducement to work and a way to get them to become a more docile population, a more dependent population. And so chemical self-medication is, again, a quintessential human response to oppression. And we see it in all places and at all times. You can also mentally avoid by escaping mentally into a kind of fantasy. And I find this most fascinating of all. The first way that you can escape into fantasy is by escaping into the past. When people's lives are incredibly uncomfortable, they begin to romanticize the past. Now, we all probably do this with our childhood. If life is hard, you got a lot of bills to pay, the car's broken down, you don't feel good. Sometimes you're tempted to pause and say, my gosh, I wish I was 10. Life was so great when I was 10, you know? I had people that took care of me. There was food on the table. My clothes suddenly appeared in my drawer clean. And the world was enchanted. I mean, I'm a simple person, but you know what made me happy when I was 10 years old? Find a good straight stick. You find a good straight stick. I'm like, this is the greatest day of my life. Look at this stick. It's incredibly straight. Oh, if life could only be that simple. Now, in reality, do I want to be 10 again? Probably not. When I was 10, I had very limited self-autonomy. My social circle was really small. I didn't get a lot of the adventures and excitement and satisfaction of living life as an adult. But when times are hard, we love to romanticize the past. And for the colonized, this often takes the form of romantically imagining their land, their people, or a kingdom that existed prior to European colonization. And these romantic pasts begin to show up in songs and in poems and in drama and in literature, and they romanticize the old ways before the Europeans arrived. Now, this romantic nostalgia is often the fuel for revolution later in the late 19th and early 20th centuries, where they're conducting revolutions on behalf of a romantic past that never actually existed. But that kind of romanticism compels people to go off and fight and give their lives for something worthwhile. And it really has its genesis here. People look at the past and it's more romantic. It's an escape. If only we could go back to that. But most interesting of all, the oppressed will escape into a cataclysmic future. And I think this is crazy interesting. When they envision a future, more times than not, they're imagining a dystopian, cataclysmic future. Why? Because the system that I live in is so ubiquitous, so oppressive, so all-consuming, that it's going to take a cataclysmic event to bring down the system. Now, we experienced this in U.S. culture as well. There was a really interesting piece that I read a while back, and I'm struggling to recall the author, but it talked about the rise of the zombies. If you're old enough to remember the 21st century, in the 20-aughts, everybody was obsessed with vampires. Everybody wanted to date a vampire, and everybody's reading vampire books. And then all of a sudden we get into the 20-teens and we see the rise of the zombies. And so we get things like World War Z and The Walking Dead and the big time bestseller, How to Survive the Zombie Apocalypse. And since then, there's been 1,000 zombie movies, series, books, graphic novels, anything you can imagine zombies. Why did we pivot away from this sort of romantic rehabilitation of vampires as something we love towards apocalyptic zombie dystopias? Well, look at what happens at the end of the 20-aughts. The great financial crisis. Suddenly people live in a world where they look around and they say, oh no, my house is being foreclosed on. I've lost my job. My investment portfolio has crashed. And as they escape in this, just like the colonized, they escape into a dystopian future. And so for 1 hour a week, they can sit down and they can watch The Walking Dead. And even though it's horrible and it's violent and it's scary, there's a certain part of their brain that says, yeah, that's pretty bad, but gosh, those people don't have to pay mortgages. Look at them just living wherever they can. Look at them coming together as a community. They don't have to worry about insurance payments or retirements. And even though they're fighting off zombies, there's a certain freedom to it. These are people liberated from the things that won't leave me alone, from the things I cannot escape, from the things that keep me up at night. And so for the colonized, we get exactly the same thing. And so we get the rise of millenarian sects in the 19th century all over the colonies, where they're predicting the end of the world or a cataclysmic coming of a god, cycles of time ending in blood and war and fire, because anything's better than what I have now. Finally, we get to resistance. When acculturation doesn't work, when you can't accommodate and you can't avoid, the only thing left for you to do is to resist. Now, we need to be careful here because when I talk about resistance, again, everybody's mind goes to armed uprising, violence, revolution, killing colonizers. But for most people, this is not their response. People don't want to engage in violence. It's always the last resort. And even though the history of empire, the imperialists often portray the indigenous as being unstable and prone to violence, what they leave out of their narratives is that the colonized pass through a series of phases of resistance until at last they arrive at violence. But violence is only the occurrence that happens after everything else has been exhausted. And so resistance is comprised of many parts. First, we have what James Scott calls the weapons of the weak. So there was an anthropologist named James Scott, and he wrote a great book called The Moral Economy of the Peasant. And he looked at peasant culture in Malaysia and the ways that they kind of subtly resist landlord oppression. And it's a story as old as humankind. When you don't have any power, how do you assert yourself? How are you supposed to resist? And these won't be foreign to you. We were all kids once, right? And so weapons of the weak, passive resistance, consist of things like foot dragging. I mean, when you were a kid, did your mom ever come look at your room and say, this place is a disgrace? How could you live like this? I need you to clean up the room, see that it's done, I'll be back. And for the next half hour, you put one or two things away, you shift things around in your room, you really don't accomplish anything. And your mother shows up after 30 minutes and she says, why haven't you done anything? And you moan and you say, oh my gosh, I don't even know where to start. There's more things in here than there are stars in the sky. I have no idea how to do it. Can you help me? Can I get out of it? Can I go play? Can I do anything but this? And your mom says, no, you're going to stay in this room until you clean it. Well, for some kids, this may turn into a 4-hour, 5-hour, 6-hour power struggle. Now, in our minds, we think to ourselves, that's not rational, right? Maybe kids aren't always rational, but if the kid really wanted to, if there was an incentive to it, the kid could clean up the room in 10 minutes. Then he could go outside and play. Life would be a lot easier on mom and dad, and life would be a lot easier on the kid. Why doesn't the kid just clean the room? Because it's not about cleaning the room. It's about asserting a small bubble of agency. It's about a powerless child telling his parents, I still have dimensions of power in this relationship. And this is how I'm demonstrating them. Another weapon of the weak is playing dumb. Everybody's done this. You're asked to do something as a child and you say, gosh, you want me to mop the floor? Do we have a mop? I don't remember us having a mop. What happened to the mop? And if I find the mop, do we have a bucket? Where would I go to get a bucket? I don't remember us owning a bucket. And you could play this out as long as you want until your mom's ready to beat you with a mop and put the bucket on your head, right? Again, same story. What I'm doing is I'm passively resisting. So you can foot drag, you can sabotage, you can play dumb. A classic, which many adults use as well, is backbiting, social sabotage. Some say it's the classic American ritual. You go to work, you work all day. After work, you go out with some friends. And what's the topic of conversation? How sucky your boss is. What an idiot he is. How incompetent administration. How company policies are so stupid. What are the employees actually doing? You would think the rational thing would be, I work all day. Maybe I'm not happy at it. I go out. The last thing I want to think about is work. But that's never what happens. All they talk about is work and how bad it is. What are they doing? They're asserting power. They're asserting agency. They're asserting a weapon of the weak. And so the colonized do this in a variety of ways. And again, if you go back and read the records, this always solicits these derogatory generalizations from imperialists, right? So the imperialists say, oh, the indigenous are lazy. Oh my goodness, the colonized are lazy people. They're not lazy. They're just asserting their resistance by foot dragging the way we did as kids, right? You have to feel that bubble of agency. You have to feel that little bit of power to keep your sanity. And again, like I talked about earlier, they say, well, the indigenous are liars. No, they're asserting their agency. The indigenous are always resistant. I always feel like they're talking bad about me in languages I don't understand. Yeah, they're asserting power against you. That's what they're doing. An additional form of resistance is known as reappropriation. And this one's super interesting. Now, Americans have kind of perfected reappropriation. It's ubiquitous in our culture, and you'll know it when I talk about it. Reappropriation is basically when you take the means of your oppression, so the symbols and the discourses and the mechanisms of your oppression, and you adopt them counter to the expectation of the oppressor. Let me give you a couple of examples. So when I was a kid in elementary school, there was a word, and it was a bad word. And you weren't supposed to say this word. This word was categorically negative and was really kind of a mean-spirited slur. And then as I got older, by the time I got into college, I saw this word everywhere. And this word was queer. And what happened to that word is what used to be a derogatory slur was adopted by the LGBT community. And they said, no, that's our word. And even though it's a word that's designated to oppress and malign us, we're going to adopt it as a label. And so now, of course, you can go to graduate school and get a degree in queer studies. Or there was the very famous show, I think on Bravo, called Queer Eye for the Straight Guy, and queer pride parades. And so the homosexual community said, no, we're going to take that word and we're going to use it as a means of empowerment and thereby divest you of your ability to use it as a form of oppression. Another very great example by the time we get to the late 1980s is, I don't know if you've seen the movie Straight Outta Compton, but by the time we get to the 1980s and crack had fully taken hold, there were all of these negative stereotypes about urban America. And many of these were affiliated with racial tropes as well. And so a young group of artists known as NWA got together and they said, when we perform our music, we're going to take all of the negative racial stereotypes about urban spaces and we're going to embody and celebrate them as a means of resistance against these tropes that otherwise would be used to oppress us. That is a classic example of reappropriation. And it's one of the most effective means of colonial resistance. And so the indigenous will often say like, oh, you think we're savages? That's right. We have been a proud tribe of savage warriors since the beginning of time. And they'll begin to embody that colonial trope. And then the imperialists are sort of left without discourse of oppression. It's really an amazing form of resistance in the colonies and throughout the human experience. But like I said, Americans, they've really kind of perfected this form of resistance. Also a form of resistance is working within the system. Now, by and large, in the history of colonial revolution, this has been the most effective. That if you're a member of the colonized, you learn how to use empire against itself. And so you can do things like use the courts, use the press, use economics. The master at this form of resistance was Mohandas Gandhi. Mohandas Gandhi learned how to work within the system to take down British imperialism. And so Gandhi trained as a barrister. He knew well how to use lawsuits and the court systems to complicate and tie down the British Empire. Gandhi understood the lumbering and inefficient nature of colonial bureaucracy and how to use it against itself. Gandhi was a master at using the press. If you really want to do an interesting historical project, go back and look at the way that the press covers the Salt March. Gandhi was a master. He was a master at turning world opinion against British Empire. Gandhi was also a master at using economics. Gandhi intuitively understood Wallerstein's world systems theory, which was a way that imperialists exploited colonies to fuel industrialization in the metropole. And so the basic summation is you wanted to have colonies so you could have the unabated flow of raw materials into the metropole, which would fuel industrialization, and they would refine those raw materials. But you also needed colonies to sell those refined products back to. And this really is the story of British imperialism, from the Opium Wars to India to British Malaya to South Africa. And this is what empire is all about. Gandhi intuitively understood this. And so Gandhi had all kinds of movements, buy local, buy indigenous, the Buy India movement. He always walked around with a spinning wheel. And his message was disrupt the colonial economic system, buy local. Don't send your products to Great Britain to fuel their industrialization, and don't buy their refined products back. Now, in the case of Gandhi, he's ultimately successful in taking down British imperialism. He's amazing. But look, when you can't acculturate, accommodate, avoid, when passive resistance is no longer effective, when appropriation doesn't ease the oppression, when the system is not working, the only thing left is open rebellion. And by the time we get to the end of the 19th and the beginning of the 20th century, this is where empire ends up. And the colonized come out in open rebellion. Now, this is really important for us to understand. Because oftentimes colonial rebellions or acts of violence are portrayed again in imperialist literature as, look at the savages. Their first impulse is always violence. Their first impulse is always savagery. And that is just not the case. That is certainly not true. What the imperialists don't understand is that the colonized have gone through every phase and every sub-phase that we have talked about today. And only then do we arrive at violence. Now, on our next episode, we're going to take a closer look at this with the rise of consciousness in Southeast Asia that eventually leads to the revolutions that end empire. Once again, thank you for listening to this episode of Asian World Podcast with Dr. Hawkins. If you'd like to support this podcast, please see the link below. Also, please check out my other published works, including an audio version of Making Moros. See you next time. Thanks.